Welcome everyone to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by GoldSilverBitcoin.com. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Thibaud Mare chal. He is vice president at Knox Custody and also co-founder at Dux Reserve. Thank you so much, Thibaud, for joining us today.
Hi, Justin. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we've seen Bitcoin evolve over the last how many years has it been now? 12 years approximately, or 13 years? They
Mhm.
keep flying on by. And we've seen it evolve from being something that's used mainly on the Silk Road to buy all sorts of drugs, although there's been academic research on the Silk Road, and the vast majority of what was being bought and sold there was cannabis, which is legal now in certain jurisdictions. And I guess at the popular culture level, probably viewed mostly on the same level as alcohol. And nowadays, Bitcoin is seen increasingly as something that's used by major corporations, nation states, even El Salvador. I tell people that El Salvador's adopted it as legal tender, and they're like, "Oh, El Salvador, whatever, that's nothing." And it's like, wow, what a myopic view. In 13 years, for something to have gone from not existing to becoming a legal tender of a nation state is like historically significant. And like, somebody just told me this recently, and I didn't even get into it with them about how like short-sighted that view is, but how short-sighted it is indeed. And you've mentioned right before we started recording that you've seen kind of Bitcoin go from this illicit commodity or asset, if you will, to something that people are discussing as a reserve currency that you're speculating if you don't hold it, for instance. Can you kind of speak to this evolution that you've seen of Bitcoin in the popular mind?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is one of the very fascinating topics around Bitcoin. Um, the narratives shifting around it, right, and how fast those shifts happen. So if you look at the most popular narrative over the last few years was, well, Bitcoin is, and it still is, right. Bitcoin is a very speculative asset. When you buy it, you should be ready to lose everything. Like, this is still quite a popular opinion in the mainstream media, unfortunately, to this day, right, in 2021. Um, and however, on the more sophisticated side of the narrative, we're seeing emerge, and we've seen it gradually sort of be normalized, this new narrative, which is, well, actually, if you don't own Bitcoin today, you're at risk, right? Not holding it is a risky decision, and I'm saying it's a decision because now there's so much information out there on the internet, on Twitter, on podcasts such as yours, on many different publications, that ignoring it is indeed a risky decision, which is, some would even push it further and say that it's an ill-informed decision. So looking at it from a macro view, those narratives, yeah, they shift pretty quickly. And there's still a lot of FUD out there around Bitcoin. So fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Bitcoin being a massive, you know, system that pollutes and consumes a lot of energy, which is true. It consumes a lot of energy, but doesn't necessarily mean that it creates substantial amounts of pollution. And so all these different narratives there, they tend to shift pretty rapidly from that kind of underground, niche, speculative asset that was only used for illicit activities back in 29 or 2010, right? To today, where it is becoming more and more adopted as a pristine asset, as a reserve asset for companies, for individuals, as a way to save, and more recently for countries to add as part of their national treasury programs. So yeah, I mean, this is fascinating to basically observe the monetization of a totally new good, monetary good, in real time, in less than what, 2 decades. It's insane, and of course, it's not there yet. But we've, in my opinion, that we've seen the shift from the first phase where Bitcoin was seen as a speculative collectible, something that was adopted by ideologists or even like criminals, we can say it, or really people who were attracted by the technical properties of Bitcoin to today, where it's moved from that speculative collectible to a reserve, store of value and a storehold of wealth, which a lot of people would say is the first step towards becoming a new monetary standard, right? Because when you look at money, you look at it from three core functions, right? Being store of value, medium of exchange, and finally unit of account. And these three different functions, they evolve in steps as the monetary good gets adopted by the market. And we've seen, the Bitcoin shift from the first phase to the second phase. And gradually it is becoming adopted worldwide by different type of individuals and institutions. And suddenly, one day perhaps we'll wake up and see that Bitcoin is that new global monetary standard. And narratives play a big role in this.
Can you tell me more about the way in which narratives play a big role there in this? So, for instance, this actually brings to mind a book I read in college while studying history. I believe I must have read it in a Soviet Union class. It was a book called Everyday Stalinism by, I believe, Sheila Fitzgerald. And I believe it's definitely Fitzgerald. And she talked about how like history is essentially just the telling of stories and that we understand each other and ourselves through narratives. So can you speak more to the importance of narrative, I guess in general, but also as it relates to Bitcoin?
Yeah, exactly, to your point, right? Human beings, like we do like stories, and good stories make up for good memories. That's how we remember things. That's how we sort of build empathy around matters and subject matters. And for Bitcoin, it's no different. And so if you look at the power of memes on the internet, I mean, the internet is full of memes on social networks. But for Bitcoin, it that is true as well. I don't know, like the last tweet, for instance, that I saw from the Nayib Bukele, right, the president of El Salvador, buying the dip, right, and so like now you're seeing a sovereign nation state in 2021 publicly announcing that they're buying the dip when Bitcoin flash crashes by 10-15% in a day. And that narrative has been sort of, it's sort of a meme, right? It's been going around on Twitter. And at the beginning, it was just what we call the Bitcoin plebs, right? Sort of pseudonymous users on Twitter buying the dip. Then we've seen corporations such as MicroStrategy buying the dip at a much larger scale. And now you're seeing nation states. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that these memes sort of pushed the president of a sovereign nation state to actually buy the dip, but essentially, in a way, it's kind of where Bitcoin is memed in reality. Like we're seeing those little micro narratives or broader narratives, such as hodl, hold your own keys, be a sovereign hodler of Bitcoin, and don't rely on trusted third parties. And we're seeing those realities sort of spread on social media and across different social circles. And I totally believe that these narratives are helping individuals and corporations sort of understand the core fundamental properties of Bitcoin and what makes it a valuable monetary good. So yeah, I mean, and there's always new narratives coming up, and these are more of the positive narratives that I've highlighted. Of course, there are pretty negative ones as well, which are often spread by the Bitcoin detractors, and I think they're good, right? You want open debates, you want narratives to clash and conflict to create good, intellectually honest debates. This is very healthy. And yeah, I mean, it's gonna ultimately the best narratives win, the best memes win, and Bitcoiners tend to have really a really solid meme game on that.
That's been interesting, actually. To you mentioned that watch the way in which the community has essentially marketed Bitcoin, and so you think about like marketing that's done in the business context, and it's very It's very clean, polished, professional, quality. These are essentially just like ideological buzzwords that are thrown around in communications departments, I think. Whereas Bitcoin, I mean, I don't think Bitcoin really none of us through osmosis were all kind of operating on those values. Rather, it was just like an anarchic, spontaneous engine of like human creativity in which anything went essentially. And that's where essentially the meme game, I think, probably excelled, was being able to create these memes that conveyed so much information in an image, regardless of how professional the image seemed, regardless of if it was clean or PC. So tell me more about, I guess, just the humanness of Bitcoin that you've observed since you've been in the space. If you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great comment you made, right? The like another one that I just remembered is the laser eyes, right? Now you're seeing CEOs, politicians, senators having laser eyes, right? It's sort of it's a laser ray till 100K, right? And so of course it's like there's a little game behind this, and we never really know when Bitcoin is going to hit 100K, but it's sort of it signals that as an individual or even a corporation, you're seeing brands use those laser rays. It sort of signals voluntary sort of participation in that, and it's beautiful. It's sort of a completely distributed marketing where the best ideas, the best memes, the best narratives, the best scripts win, and then gets broad acceptance, and there's no authority dictating or coercing anyone into adopting that. And I think this is where in such a system you're going to see the best outcome for everybody, right? Because sort of private property and individual liberties are maintained, you're getting the best out of everyone, and everyone is sort of pulling each other up. And personally, like I've experienced this in being exposed to the Bitcoiners and the different Bitcoin communities, whether it be around Second Amendment rights, or meat, carnivore diets, or self-consciousness, cold showers, what else? Austrian economics, cryptography, distributed systems. Like there's a lot of different themes and topics that sort of really float around Bitcoin. And essentially, yeah, you're seeing sort of personal change in everybody who's involved in those debates and open discussions, because it's not about the individual, it's not about your credentials, it's not about your ethnicity, your age, your location. Like all of that doesn't matter. It's about your ideas, your intellectual rigor, and your ability to convey ideas in memorable and sort of debatable chunks of information. And this is via Twitter. And so I guess all of these like little interactions, they personally, I know they made me a much better writer, because you have to synthesize your ideas in like tweets and be interesting to people, add value in the debates, don't take things personally, and so on. And it makes it made me a better debater, helped me understand things that I had in the total wrong way before, whether it be around nutrition, exercise, economics, and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, via these open debates and sort of this anarchist system, and to your point, right, Bitcoin is the purest form of anarchy, perhaps, right? And it's funny because like when we hear about the word anarchy, we hear about chaos usually in mainstream media, but anarchy actually is the complete opposite. It's emergent order. It's order without authority. That's what anarchy means. Um, and I would argue that Bitcoin and the sort of peripheral conversations and ideas and projects around it is a good, practical, concrete example of that instantiation of anarchy today.
Do you have any further comments on the intersection of anarchy and Bitcoin, or the history of anarchic thought, and like your relation to it, or rather your study of it? I think to maybe narrow down a little bit first before we go there, I think there was a big overlap, at least in the United States Bitcoin industry. And I think that
Mm,
there is meaningful culture on each continent. I think that the oceans do impact culture in such a way to where humans are different in different countries, and especially on different continents. And so I speak mainly to at least the US Bitcoin community in particular, which was very, I guess, like amorphous. Like, of course, we're interacting all the time, dating back since the beginning of Bitcoin via Skype, via these apps. Like the stay at home, we were like, well, certainly when the stay at home culture was implemented, or when 2019 came to pass and there were the lockdown orders, like I have a sneaking hunch that the lives of Bitcoiners were some of the least impacted, although they might have been some of the most vociferous critics thereof. So now I think the US based Bitcoin community, dating back to, I think, the nascence of Bitcoin in particular, has been overlapping with like libertarian ideas, Austrian economic ideas. And these are in some ways, libertarianism and Austrianism are related, or at least cousins, kin spirits of anarchism, and appear not anarcho communism or anarcho syndicalism necessarily. I don't think, at least in my understanding of anarcho syndicalism, but more of like I hesitate to say what is generally colloquially referred to as anarcho capitalism, although I have a feeling many anarcho capitalists have never read Adam Smith's texts, nor have I. So I don't claim to be an anarcho capitalist, but maybe a better term would be anarcho-Austrianism, for instance. At any rate, can you kind of speak about the intersection of like anarchy, Bitcoin, and like your view of anarchy?
a Bitcoiner would be a good term for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, to your point, so I'm not a political theory type of guy, and anarchy is usually tied to left wing type of ideologies. And I don't want to go into that rabbit hole because I don't really know it. But also, I think removing politics from any of these discussions is will make up for a more productive conversation overall. Um, when it comes to anarchy or anarcho-capitalism or capitalism, like generally speaking, the idea behind all of this, including also Austrian economics, is the notion of private property and making sure that um, there is an assurance that private property is guaranteed for individuals, because private property, if you don't have private property, well, why bother take risk, and why bother launch new ventures and do investments if anybody can come to you any day and sort of expropriate you from that property that you earned uh, through your work and time and dedication and energy. So um, and if you look at capitalism and Austrian economics from that lens, which it is, I think, yeah, private property and the defense of it is the most fundamental, layer of guarantee that one should have. If anything needs to be built on top of it, anything of value of lasting contribution to humanity can be built. It needs to be built on that standard. And I think why Bitcoiners are so attracted to these ideas, um, or why people in sort of anarcho-capitalist type of circles become interested in Bitcoin, is because Bitcoin is a tool which allows you to get those guarantees. Like nobody can take Bitcoin away from you if you hold your own keys and run your node. Um, and whether it be via force, or inflation, which is sort of a dilution of your Bitcoin ownership, of the holdings that you've earned over time. And so it's a pretty powerful tool, because today, of course, as many of your viewers must know, monetary inflation sort of is that taxation without due representation, which sort of steals from people's savings over time. And so if that sort of root layer of society is broken, which is the function of money, which includes the necessity to be able to store wealth over time, then nobody and nothing, nobody is protected and nothing is guaranteed, right? Beyond that. And so private property being the most important things of all, if you can't get that assurance of private property protection in your money, then it's hard to build anything meaningful, and that is sort of long lasting. And so Bitcoin sort of brings back and completely destroys that paradigm by bringing back this notion of private property, and this is done via this sound money that Austrian economics often refer to, and Bitcoiners like to talk about, in my view, which is the reason why Bitcoin is so valuable, and it's much bigger than just making money and becoming wealthy out of holding Bitcoin. You're basically participating in the sort of rise of a new monetary standard, which protects private property, and that is extremely valuable, because if people can store wealth in money that they control, then it means that you're rewarded if you lower your time preference. Meaning, if you delay instant gratification and you save for the long term, instead of consuming every day, you save so that you can invest in the future, and start a new venture, or raise a family, or do productive things that you would want to do in the future with money that you haven't spent. Then overall, like, you're going to be better off, right? It's like the famous example of a sort of the guy who's going to be fishing fish every day with his bare hands, and one day he decides to stop, and he's not going to fish for 3 days, but he's going to build a nest, right? And the fourth day, when he comes back fishing, he gets 10 fish all at once, right? So his productivity increases, and so his sort of standard of living increases as well. And that is true for society in general, and for human beings today. And that requires being able to save, which is the basis of capital accumulation, and capital is the basis of investment, and an investment, if done well, is the basis of that productivity increase, which allows us to do more with less, which raises our standard of living. And so, yeah, all of this is of course connected, and it's there's a lot of different themes that we can discuss from that logic, but Bitcoin is the tool which allows that new virtuous cycle, right, to be restored. And so if you think about it, you realize that it's a pretty big deal, because if you get that virtuous cycle back, then prosperity awaits us, and that'll take, I don't know how many years, right? Nobody knows, but directionally it seems inevitable that Bitcoin is going to have a tremendously positive impact on the world.
You mentioned earlier about that there are detractors, and that having an open debate about Bitcoin is good. And I think we do see a few different types of these debates. And I'm a little bit more, skeptical of like arguments that Bitcoin's a Ponzi scheme, for instance, or that it's a scam, or that people who bought early are just selling it to the latecomers. So, for instance, I believe that's largely what Peter Schiff's argument revolves around. And unfortunately, that is not sophisticated enough for me, because he is so good on other topics. I think he's great on economics. So, like, for instance, when Peter Schiff goes on Joe Rogan and discusses economics, the data is good data that people are getting. It's good information. It's, I believe, a correct analysis of how the economy works. But then on the Bitcoin front, his analysis is leaves something to be desired, to say the least. And then there's I think, a different kind of class of critique, and so that critique might revolve around whether new technologies will make Bitcoin obsolete, whether that be quantum computing or otherwise. Other critiques might be that the governance infrastructure of Bitcoin is broken. I think that's a very valid discussion that should be had and continued to be had. And I'm sure there's some other critiques that I appreciate and make me see things in a new light. So can you kind of talk about the detractors and some of the interesting arguments that you've heard around the topic of whether Bitcoin is viable for centuries?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, money is a technology, right, which allows humans to cooperate with people that they don't really know personally. It's a great technology which should, as we said, help you store wealth over time, move wealth across space, and ultimately measure things of value around you, so that you have a common language with other people who are selling or buying services around you. Um, and I guess the biggest critique, which would be valid for Bitcoin as a new technology for money, is if it becomes totally useless. And I think the first person that I've heard mention this was Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, talking about the single biggest issue with Bitcoin, and sort of perhaps the only way Bitcoin could fail is if we were coming back to a gold standard. If nation states were to adopt a gold standard once again, and were sort of trusted with a reasonable sort of fractional reserve banking system with good gold storage, reserve ratios, and ultimately efficient settlement between countries, physical settlement of gold. Like if that system were to come back, so backing fiat currencies, which to this day are backed by debt, not a commodity that has some level of scarcity, um, then yeah, it could render Bitcoin obsolete. But the reality for this to happen is theoretically it is possible. Practically speaking, it is highly improbable. And so if you look at it from this lens, then all of the other FUD around Bitcoin, whether it be quantum computing or a better cryptocurrency emerging or the internet being shut down, like again, theoretically, these are um, valid sort of critics, but practically speaking, they don't stand. Um, and so, like if you take, for instance, like the notion that another cryptocurrency could outcompete Bitcoin, I think you're looking at Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general from the wrong lens, because this thing is not about, it's not a technology revolution, it's a monetary evolution. Bitcoin's technology has nothing crazy. Like it's pretty boring. Like all the technology stacks, the different things that have been used in the Bitcoin protocol, they've been around for decades. Whether it is cryptography, public key cryptography, right, distributed systems, hashes, time stamping, like all of these little things together make up for a really interesting solution, which is Bitcoin. But the different technologies themselves are they've been out there for a while. And so ultimately, it's not a battle of who's got the best features in tech, but it's a matter of can you enforce scarcity for a monetary good without trusting anybody in the maintenance of the cap of the limit. And Bitcoin, we all know it's a hard limit of 21 million units. And so today Bitcoin has been pretty successful at maintaining this because it is truly distributed. Um, and distributed is a binary measure. It either is or it's not. And so it's absolutely distributed. It is purely distributed. And if you look at other cryptocurrencies, for instance, which are usually used in critics of Bitcoin, right? Um, they are decentralized, which is a relative measure. It evolves on a spectrum. It is more or less decentralized. And if you look at decentralized systems in general, and it's true for cryptocurrencies, but beyond that, they tend to come back to centralization, because the more you centralize things, the more efficient the system becomes at, taking decisions faster, at updating the state of affair in that system more rapidly, and so on and so on. And so we're seeing it on other cryptocurrencies to this day, that they used to be kind of decentralized, so more or less, and now they're centralizing, because whether it be bandwidth limits or computational limits, or and and so this is why all these critics on technology ultimately don't really stand, because it's a matter of it really is a matter of monetary evolution, and the only thing that matters in this is one thing, and it was coined by Nick Szabo, I think. It's the unforgeable costliness of Bitcoin, which is to say that in order for new Bitcoins to be created, there needs to be energy that is expended via proof of work. Um, and this system is uh, guaranteed by something that has been out there forever, which is the first principle of thermodynamics, which is the conservation of energy, which basically says, it's quite simple. It says that you can't create energy or destroy energy out of nowhere. It has to be transformed. It has to be created with work, with with effort. And so yeah, so that is sort of in my mind, like a battle that was lost in 2009. And essentially, when Bitcoin launched on the 3rd of January 2009, it was actually the last cryptocurrency that was ever launched, because there's been a lot of different attempts at digital cash before. Perhaps, I don't know, 20-30 projects. There are a few that are pretty popular, right? Digigold, eCash, Liberty Reserve, like a lot of different currencies, but they all failed because they were more or less centralized or more or less decentralized. Um, and so, yeah, to this day, detractors, I don't think they've looked at Bitcoin the right way, because if you look at it from this lens, then you understand that it's actually the last successful cryptocurrency, and perhaps the only one that is able to last longer than any of us, and because the law of thermodynamics is not going anywhere, and so we're decaying as human beings, and Bitcoin is getting stronger by the block. So yeah, detractors should perhaps revisit their mental models.
I think that were governments to adopt a gold standard with a reasonable fractional reserve standard, and I believe actually that's the way it's always worked. There was never a fully gold standard. It was generally like, I think 40% of the were held in the reserves of the money supply. With that stated, let's say this did happen. I don't know if that would necessarily make Bitcoin obsolete. It would certainly drop the cost of everything pretty much, I believe, correct? Let's say we adopt gold standards. So that means that there's now a limit to the amount of monies that can be circulating, which would then increase its value, because if you print more, they become individually worth less. And if they're worth more, then everything else would be worth less. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, a gold, like a full gold standard, would technically, theoretically, could exist, right? But you would need really strong guarantees of private property protection and strong constitutions where, for instance, the governments should not be able to take on debt. And I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said this, one of the founding fathers in the US, saying that if he could add one amendment to the Constitution, it would have been to remove the power for the federal government to get into debt. Because if there is such a power, then the government is incentivized to find ways to actually use that lever to increase its ability to finance itself outside of taxation, and ultimately dilute the currency, and so sort of get off the gold standard. So I think you cannot have a gold standard unless governments are forbidden to take on debt, and that would be a really interesting system, because ultimately I do believe governments are useful, because there's a lot of debate around the role of governments as institutions these days, particularly in circles of Bitcoiners, and I do believe that if government should be there to enforce and protect private property rights. So courts of justice with transparent and fair laws, with stable legislation, is really important for business. It's important for families. It's important for liberties, and but that would sort of revisit completely the role of a government and its size. Also, it would force governments to shrink substantially, because if you remove their ability to issue debt, which is ultimately often purchased by a central bank, which dilutes the currency of their citizens, then their only way to get financing is via taxation. And taxation, it better be used the right way. Like if your budget fully relies on taxing your citizens, then your citizens are going to want to get sort of a better view in terms of how you handle your finances, because there's a direct um, transfer of capital from citizens, individuals, and families to the government. Um, but yeah, you know, in my opinion, of course, that system where governments cannot issue debt is going to be really hard to implement, especially these days, where, again, narratives, right? Political narratives are much more important than fiscal responsibility and sort of proper budget management for these people. So yeah, I mean, and I think this is where Bitcoin could help, perhaps, in that transition. It may take forever to happen, but because it sort of removes the ability for governments to have their debt purchased by a central bank, because ultimately nobody can print more Bitcoin. Um, it will gently force governments in the future to revisit their budgets, right, and their spendings, and because otherwise they're going to have to raise taxes, and that is, of course, not something that's popular. Like we've seen it in France with the yellow vest. We're seeing it across the board on a bunch of different countries. So yeah, it's to me, a gold standard is not going to happen again. The Bitcoin standard may. There are different steps for us to get there, and I don't know all the steps, and I have no clue how long it'll take. But it's our best shot at sort of again allowing individuals to get good property right protection, and ultimately bring back prosperity to everyone. And again, like a lot of people would tell me, like, you're naive, or this is like willful thinking. And yeah, let's debate it, right? Let's sort of poke holes and like break the logic and see where it's flawed, and happy to revisit that statement.
What, in your opinion, have been the biggest stories in Bitcoin throughout the year 2021?
I'm hesitant between two. Taproot being activated, soft fork, which allows sort of better privacy on chain, and much denser blocks of transactions, which would increase the throughput and allow more flexibility behind the programming of Bitcoin transactions. And that it must be mirrored with the events and the block size war that happened in 2017, where it was a soft fork as well. It was much more contentious, and there's been a lot of heated debates in the different communities around Bitcoin. And this time around, Taproot went so smoothly. So that was sort of in my opinion, like a really a beautiful highlight in terms of the governance that you mentioned of Bitcoin, or the lack thereof, and its smooth operation. And perhaps a second as important event of adoption this year, of course, would be El Salvador. The first public nation state of roughly 7 million people to make Bitcoin legal tender in their jurisdiction. That's a pretty big deal. It's the first domino, and perhaps will influence a lot of other nation states. So yeah, these two are very, very important.
A lot of the U.S. foreign policy post World War II was based on this idea of, I guess, contagion and the domino effect, so that if one country turned communist, then its neighbors would inevitably. And it's interesting that you use this term in the context of Bitcoin in El Salvador. What is Taproot?
So Taproot it uses a new signature curve for Bitcoin, which is basically how transactions are authorized by wallets in the network. And Taproot uses Schnorr, which is a new way to sign transactions, simpler way. Some people would say no, but making it very simple. And I'm not a sort of cryptography expert, so bear with me. But basically, Schnorr is a linear way to sign transactions, as opposed to the elliptic curve that Bitcoin currently uses. And so Taproot, by using the properties of Schnorr, will allows this day, because it's live in Bitcoin mainnet, it allows wallets to have much simpler signatures. So basically, if your wallet has a multi-signature scheme, which require different authorizers to sign on a transaction, so with different keys, you used to have to broadcast the script, which basically stored and protected your Bitcoin. And so it would be kind of a privacy leak. And today, you don't have to broadcast all the different signatures, which would apply to that same multi-signature wallet using Taproot. You only need to use an aggregate of all the signatures that were applied, whether it be 2 signers or 20 signers. And so for corporations, for trusts, families, and other use cases that we haven't thought about, it's very interesting, because you essentially can get guarantees of multi-signature, which is very useful without leaking any privacy. And overall, it makes Bitcoin transactions so smaller in that sense. And so it means you can fit more of these transactions in blocks, and ultimately increase the throughput of the network. Yeah, that's sort of very simplified, and there are other applications, but it's sort of the gist of it.
Can you tell us more about what you do at Knox Custody and what Knox Custody does?
Yeah, so Knox Custody was founded in 2018 as sort of a Bitcoin key management infrastructure provider. So to this day, Knox has built um, key management infrastructure, which is used with exchanges and funds in Canada to help them custody Bitcoin, whether using Knox as the hosted service provider, or whether it is deploying their own internal infrastructure of key management. So allowing institutions to hold their own keys while getting some additional guarantees that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get if you were to build that system from scratch. And the biggest element of that is, of course, insurance. So Knox, since day one, has worked with insurance providers to help them understand all the risks that are involved in custodying Bitcoin, and helping Knox's clients get um, insurance coverage, which protects them against theft and loss. And so what I do over there, I work with the product team and our customers and prospective clients to help them understand how to best take control of their keys, deploy insurance policies which help them get adequate coverage based on their internal needs, and control requirements, because some companies that are holding BTC need to get some guarantees of coverage, or of basically wallet governance, like who has access control to the wallet, for how big of a transaction and so on. And so yeah, working with clients and prospects on all these things, and trying to sort of help, whether it be individuals or companies, get a good balance of security and simplicity in managing their Bitcoin assets versus sovereignty. And of course, you give away a little bit of sovereignty because you're working with Knox, but you're getting significant security guarantees in return.
And what are you up to with Dux Reserve as well? I know you're a co-founder there.
Yeah, so Dux Reserve is a company I launched in France. So I came back to France last summer, and we're helping French people understand Bitcoin as a savings vehicle, and help individuals and small businesses stack sats. So really build Bitcoin savings over time, accumulate Bitcoin, and take control of their keys with 100% control and full independence. And that's been so yeah, we got registered with the French regulators last summer, and we've launched operations in September of this year. So it's pretty recent.
How's Nice?
It's beautiful, except the beach, which is made of little stones. There's no sand in Nice.
I when I was 18, right after I graduated high school, I was so privileged to be able to go to Europe, and I was going to go to Nice from Prague, but I believe instead my friends and I hatched this plan to just instead go back to Amsterdam. I think that
Of
was
course, we don't have coffee shops in Nice, right?
I think that was short-sighted. However, I made some other decisions on that trip that I think paid dividends by visiting like Normandy and stuff. Whereas my friends went and saw Wedding Crashers. They're not Bitcoiners. They're not Bitcoiners. So
Not yet.
yeah. Any other kind of comments as we come to a close here about what you've seen in 2021 on the Bitcoin front and what you expect from 2022?
Yeah. So what I've seen is, there's a lot of work that has been done on open source, particularly sort of standardization around development, which is really interesting. Thinking about the Bitcoin development kit and the Lightning development kit now, spearheaded by Jack Dorsey's team at Spiral BTC, which used to be Square Crypto. And we're seeing sort of important leaders like Jack Dorsey. And again, I don't want to go and sort of create sort of a god out of him, right? But it's striking to see smart, successful entrepreneurs like himself turn to Bitcoin only services, and sort of push support for open source development. I think that's quite telling, around the sort of natural equilibrium that we're seeing around Bitcoin, and sort of this convergent point, what we usually call the Schelling point in game theory. Um, but that's a whole other topic. And I guess, yeah, in the future, 2022, 2023, um, number go up, right? Bitcoin is expected to keep doing what it's doing best, which is producing blocks every 10 minutes on average, and demonetizing other asset classes, whether it be real estate or gold, for that matter, in some shape or form. So yeah, we shall see, but definitely more adoption, more people stacking sats, and gradually, then suddenly becoming a new monetary standard.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Thibaud Mare chal. He is the vice president of Knox Custody, as well as co-founder of Dux Reserve. Thank you so much, Thibaud, for joining us today.
Thank you, Justin. It was a great time.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.